While the world's greatest army was helpless, the only person who could solve this global crisis was an old meteorologist nobody listened to. Have you ever had a moment where you said, "I told you so"? Because he wasn't looking at modern radar data, but at the old journals of French scientists who followed Napoleon's army in 1812, and what he saw was history repeating itself. The Rub al-Khali Desert in Saudi Arabia, the empty quarter, was a place that lived up to its name. It was a geography where the most fundamental rules of life were suspended, a place that God had forgotten when creating the world, or perhaps had intentionally left untouched. By day, the sun hung in the sky like a white hole, burning the dunes with a merciless light that made them glitter like broken glass. The air was a blast wave from a furnace, filling the lungs and making it difficult to breathe. By night, this hell transformed into a frozen paradise, where the trillions of stars of the Milky Way shone with an incredible clarity, with not a single competing light on Earth to challenge them. In the midst of this infinite and silent sea, anything man-made seemed an anomaly, an act of hubris. And Site Sever was the pinnacle of that hubris. Non-existent on official maps, positioned to remain in the blind spot of satellites, this top-secret American drone operations and surveillance base was a symbol of humanity's victory over nature. The structure, partially buried underground, looked no different from a dune shaped by the wind from the outside. But beneath that sand lay a marvel of technology and engineering, a fortress that produced its own water, drew its own energy from the sun, and could sustain itself for months, completely isolated from the outside world. The atmosphere inside was always kept at 21 degrees Celsius, a mockery of the 50-degree hell outside. This was the kingdom of Major Ava Rostova. Rostova was one of the brightest minds in the Air Force. She had built her career on the belief that emotions and intuition had a margin of error, but that data and technology spoke the absolute truth. For her, Site 7 was a perfect system. Everything was measurable. Everything was predictable. On that day, as usual, she was in the cool, dim environment of the command center, watching the rivers of data flowing across the massive holographic screens before her. Everything was normal. Everything was under control. The first anomaly arrived like a whisper. An external perimeter sensor reported a sudden, sharp drop in barometric pressure, unpredicted by any of the models. A second later, another, then a dozen more. On the screen, in the middle of the blue and green, a tiny blood-red dot appeared directly over the base. "What's the situation?" Rostova asked, without a trace of concern in her voice. "We can't make sense of it, Major," a young technician replied, his voice laced with confusion. "The pressure just bottomed out, as if a vacuum was created instantly. But the wind speed is 0. It's impossible." Rostova frowned. There was no such thing as impossible, only data that had not yet been explained. But at that moment, a low-frequency, vibrating hum began to emanate from the metal walls of the base, a sound they had never heard before. It was different from the monotonous whir of the air conditioners and servers, something deeper, more organic, as if a giant beehive had awakened beneath the sands. And then the temperature began to drop. This was not the slow, natural cooling of a desert night. It was such a savage and unnatural plunge. Within 5 minutes, the external sensors read 35 degrees. In 10 minutes, 20. Everyone in the command center stared at the screens, frozen. 20 minutes later, the temperature fell below 0. The lenses of the external security cameras first fogged over, then frosted, then cracked. The last image from the outside shown on the screens was of something strange and white beginning to fall from the sky instead of sand. Snow.
In the middle of the Rub al-Khali Desert, on one of the hottest days in history, it was snowing. But this was not the soft, fluffy snow of childhood memories. It was hard, needle-like, made of ice crystals, like sandpaper falling from the sky. When it struck the roof of the base and the communication towers, it made a sound like shattering glass. Within an hour, Site 7 was buried under a blanket of white. The metal groaned under the extreme and sudden change in temperature, and the expanding ice crushed sensitive equipment like tin cans. The solar panels cracked, the communication towers toppled, and the supposedly unbreakable fiber optic lines that connected the base to the outside world were severed. Site 7 was trapped inside its own technological fortress in the middle of a white hell. When the investigation began, Eva Rostova found herself in a nightmare. When rescue teams reached the base, the scene they encountered was no different from a battlefield, but there were no bomb craters or bullet holes. Only ice, silence, and frozen chaos. For the first time in her career, Rostova was faced with a situation where data and logic were completely useless. The generals at the Pentagon were convinced that this was a new type of weapon. A directed energy weapon? A technology that could alter the climate? Had a rival nation achieved a power that no one could have imagined? The world's best physicists, military scientists, and engineers were mobilized to study the data and debris collected from Site 7, but no one could explain the phenomenon. It was an event that overturned the known laws of physics. Rostova's team chased a ghost for weeks. Every theory led to a dead end, and just as all hope was fading, a young analyst on her team made a suggestion, almost sheepishly. "Major, there's a man, Dr. Aris Thorne. He's known as the madman of the meteorological community. He studies historical weather events and their anomalies. No one takes him seriously, but maybe he could look at it from a different angle." Eva Rostova hated different angles her entire life, but now she was desperate. Reluctantly, she gave the order to find this madman. Dr. Aris Thorne lived far from civilization, in a cluttered house filled with books, maps, old barometers, and handwritten notes. He was a man in his 70s, with eyes that held the weariness of a sage and the curiosity of a child. When Rostova visited him, Thorne looked at her shiny uniform and confident posture with a condescending smile. "So," Thorne said, taking a puff from his pipe, "your numbers have failed you, Major." Rostova, straining her patience, explained the event to him. The sudden drop in temperature, the strange ice crystals, the electrical anomalies. Thorne listened to her carefully, but he did not want to see the modern radar data or satellite images. Instead, he stood up and walked to his library. "History," Thorne muttered, running his fingers along the shelves. "The greatest mistake people make is to think of history as just a collection of stories. In fact, history is a data set that we just don't yet know how to read." And then he took down his most prized possession from the shelf, the digitized copies of the private journals of the brilliant French scientist Pierre-Simon Laplace, who had accompanied Napoleon's disastrous Russian campaign of 1812. "The official history," Thorne said, opening his computer, "tells us that General Winter defeated Napoleon's Grande Armée. But Laplace knew that that winter was not normal." Thorne began to read passages from Laplace's journal. Laplace wrote that in some areas the army passed through, the weather had turned unnaturally, suddenly, and incredibly cold, that the sky had taken on strange colors, and that the snow was unlike any type of snow they knew. He had developed a theory, acoustic resonance. He postulated that on a specific terrain, under a specific atmospheric pressure, a powerful and continuous low-frequency sound, such as that created by the volley fire of artillery, could instantly crystallize the supercooled water vapor in the upper layers of the atmosphere, creating a local and devastating blizzard. This theory had been dismissed as nonsense by the scientific community of the time, and Laplace, to avoid ridicule, had buried his research in the most secret pages of his journal. When Thorne finished reading, there was a deep silence in the room. He fixed his eyes on Rostova.
"The attack on Site 7 was not a new weapon, Major," Thorne said. "It was the deliberate and perfect application of Laplace's 200-year-old forgotten theory. Your enemy did not invent a weather machine. They found the recipe for it in a history book no one else was reading." Eva Rostova was experiencing an intellectual shock she had never felt before in her life. It was impossible, but it was also the most logical explanation she had heard. Still, she had doubts. "How can we prove this, Doctor?" "Laplace thought of that too," Thorne said, smiling. "In his journal, he mentions a side effect of this acoustic resonance. The frequency leaves a unique microscopic hexagonal crystal fracture pattern on any glass surface it is exposed to. Ask your men to examine the broken glass pieces from the base under an electron microscope." Rostova, without hesitation, grabbed her phone. Hours later, the response from the lab turned Thorne's theory into an irrefutable fact. On the glass, there was the exact strange, unnatural pattern that Thorne had described. Now the question was not what, but who, and Thorne had an idea about that too. To create this sound, you need a huge amount of energy and something like a giant tuning fork, he said. Look at the seismic and acoustic records from just before the storm, but don't look for normal anomalies. Look for a continuous, monotonous, low-frequency hum, like the desert's own heartbeat, but artificial. The old data was rescanned in the light of this new theory, and bingo. A faint but constant hum, starting 12 hours before the storm and ending at the exact moment the storm hit, emanating from a seemingly empty spot in the middle of the desert. For the first time in her life, Eva Rostova was leading an operation not with the most advanced technological weapons, but with the wisdom of an old man's memories and a 200-year-old journal. When they reached the designated coordinates, they saw nothing at first, just sand and wind. But the thermal cameras detected a massive energy source operating a few meters under the sand. When they began to dig, what they faced was the new and terrifying face of modern warfare. A series of massive metal structures resembling tuning forks, half buried in the sand and humming in synchronization with each other. The weapon was not a laser cannon or a missile launcher. The weapon was an orchestra, a silent and invisible orchestra that used nature itself as its instrument. The engineers and soldiers operating the facility were captured in a small underground bunker with little resistance. They were just technicians executing an equation. The real genius was the one who had found Laplace's journal and turned it into a weapon. Weeks later, after the silent weapon had been captured and the world continued on, unaware of the catastrophe it had averted, Rostova visited Eris Thorne at his home one last time. This time she came not as a skeptic, but as a student. Thorne was sitting in his usual chair reading the 1812 journal. He looked up at Rostova. "History," he said, his voice both tired and wise, "is not just a story of what happened, Major. It is an arsenal of what is possible." Rostova understood in that moment a truth that the most advanced satellites or the fastest computers could not see. The past was never dead. It wasn't even past. It was just quietly waiting for the right resonance to create its next storm. In the forgotten arsenal of history lie weapons the modern world can scarcely imagine. For more stories that reveal how the echoes of the past can shape the wars of today, don't forget to subscribe to Parallel Storylines. See you in the next case file.